Okay, next let's look at some of the subregions of the Pacific realm. And the regions can be divided into three. There is Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. So Melanesia includes Papua New Guinea, the large island here, and some of the bigger islands. Micronesia includes a lot of really tiny dots of islands in the north of Melanesia. And then we have Polynesia, which is essentially a triangle from Hawaii, Easter Island, and then down to New Zealand. So these names have been around for a while. This is an old maritime map showing Micronesia, Melanesia, which included Australia here, and Polynesia. And let's go over these really quick. Melanesia, which means the Black Islands, it's kind of a racial. The islands aren't actually black, but the people are darker skinned, and so I think that was sort of a racial term. But anyway, that's the term that is applied to these islands here, including Papua New Guinea. And this is the most populated region in the Pacific. And because it includes Papua New Guinea, which is the most populated country, about 8 million people live in Papua New Guinea. That's not a large population, but it's large relative to the small islands of the Pacific. Next, we have Micronesia, which means tiny islands. These are about 2,000 or more tiny islands, and mostly low islands. These are mostly atolls in this part of the Pacific. And then you have this large triangle of Polynesia. And this also includes Hawaii, which is a state of the United States, obviously, Easter Island, and then all the way down to New Zealand, and a mix of high and low islands in Polynesia. So Papua New Guinea is actually part of the Australian continent here. It's part of this Guinea island. And if we look at it from space and compare, this is Australia at the bottom. You can see it's fairly dry and desert-like, and Papua New Guinea is quite different. Papua New Guinea is actually fairly mountainous, and it's also forested. And it is rich in biodiversity, that it is a tropical rainforest region. So Papua New Guinea, while not far from Australia, is quite different physically. Okay, so here's the realm again, and if we kind of blow up and take a closer look at this map, one thing you might notice is that a lot of the names of the islands have a little abbreviation at the end, like NZ or Hawaii, US, that there is many of the islands remain territories, or they're not called colonies, but they're non-self-governed entities. So the French, the British, New Zealand, Australia are often administrators of these different islands. That unlike other parts of the world, like in Africa, there's not as much of a move for independence by these small island countries, because they're often dependent on the host country for aid and for other things. Because when you're isolated like that, it's hard to have much of an economy, and very small populations, not a big economy. So a lot of these island countries are dependent on Australia or the United States or others for aid, and they're very slow to try to gain their independence because of that dependency. And just to wrap up, I just want to show a couple of things. This is showing the situation in the Pacific right at the beginning of World War II. And so in World War II, the United States fought with Japan, which seems like sort of odd that because they're so far away from each other. But if you look at who controlled which islands at the time, Japan controlled a large amount of the Pacific, and the United States did as well, including Hawaii and Midway. And so really, if you kind of extend the United States and Japan into the Pacific, they really were right up next to each other. And for the polar area, this is Antarctica, and it's showing who has land claims to it, the individual countries, including Argentina, Australia, the British, Chile. One country that's noticeably missing is the United States. The United States has a lot of research teams that work in Antarctica. It doesn't actually have land claims. And I'm going to include a video that talks about borders in the polar regions that will explain a bit more. And then lastly, this is also showing the North Pole. Various countries are making it sort of a land grab going on, especially with climate change. As the climate gets warmer at the poles, this is showing a Russian robot trying to plant a Russian flag at the North Pole. And as the climate gets warmer, the idea is that shipping routes might open up in the North Pole region, and there's also oil resources in many parts here. And lastly, one thing I want to note about the Pacific is the amazing journey. This is one of the last parts of the world to be inhabited by humans. And this even goes back to Madagascar, which we've talked about in the past, New Zealand, Hawaiian Islands. And there could be an argument that they've made their way all the way to South America, but that is not completely proven, but there is evidence that people made their way in the Pacific all the way across. And much earlier than any other journeys by the Europeans or others. And so one of the notable things is what an incredible journey that is, and what the boating technology that was required to do this. So I'm going to include a bit longer video that talks about the human migrations into the Pacific. And so I encourage you to watch that. It's kind of an amazing journey that people took to this very last part of the earth to be inhabited by humans.